January 30th, 1945. 1940 hours. Captain Juan Pajota crouched behind the wooden supports of the Cabu River Bridge in Nueva Ecija, Philippines, watching 1,000 Japanese soldiers preparing for evening formation on the far bank. Behind him, 200 Filipino guerrillas waited in firing positions along the riverbank. In 30 minutes, American Rangers would attack a prisoner of war camp 800 yards to the south. If those 1,000 Japanese soldiers crossed this bridge, every Ranger and every prisoner would die. Pajota had fought the Japanese for 3 years. He knew their tactics, knew their weapons, knew how they thought. He also knew the mathematics of what he was about to do. 200 guerrillas against 1,000 trained infantry supported by tanks. The numbers said he would lose. The numbers said his men would break and run within minutes. The numbers said this bridge would be swarming with Japanese reinforcements before the Rangers could evacuate a single prisoner. But Pajota had something the numbers did not account for. He had a bridge rigged with explosives, a V-shaped choke point, and 25 landmines buried in the approach. He had machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. And he had men who had watched the Japanese murder, starve and torture their countrymen for 3 years. Men who would die before letting those soldiers cross. What happened in the next 45 minutes would become one of the most lopsided defensive engagements in the Pacific War. Against impossible odds, Pajota and his guerrillas would kill more than 400 Japanese soldiers while suffering 21 killed themselves. They would destroy tanks, annihilate flanking attempts, and hold that bridge long enough for the Rangers to complete their mission. And the entire operation would rest on a decision Pajota had made 3 days earlier, a decision that had nothing to do with firepower and everything to do with understanding what his enemy could not see. The first American prisoner at Cabanatuan was Sergeant James Baldassare, captured at Bataan on April 9, 1942. Baldassare had been a supply clerk with the 31st Infantry Regiment. He watched Japanese bombers destroy his unit's equipment, watched his commanders surrender, and then began what prisoners would later call the Bataan Death March, 65 miles over 5 to 10 days. No food, no water. Men who fell were bayoneted where they lay. Men who asked for water were shot. Men who helped their friends were beaten to death. Of the 76,000 men who began that march, fewer than 54,000 reached Camp O'Donnell alive. Baldassare survived. He weighed 170 pounds when he surrendered. He weighed 112 pounds when he reached O'Donnell. 3 months later, he weighed 94 pounds when they transferred him to Cabanatuan. At Cabanatuan, prisoners received 2 meals per day, rice mixed with water. Sometimes with weevils. Sometimes with pieces of vegetable so rotten they could not be identified. Starvation rations for men performing hard labor in tropical heat. The Japanese camp commander was Lieutenant Colonel Shigeji Mori. Mori believed that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, that men who surrendered deserved no mercy, no humanity, no consideration beyond what was required to extract labor. His orders were clear. Work them until they die. If they cannot work, let them die faster. By the end of 1942, 2,642 Americans had died at Cabanatuan. Disease killed most of them. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, dengue fever. Infections that would have been treatable anywhere else but at Cabanatuan meant death because there was no medicine. The Japanese provided none. They forbade the prisoners from receiving any from outside. Baldassare watched men die in the barracks next to him. He watched them die in the latrines, too weak to stand. He watched them die during formation, collapsing in the morning Sunday. And every week, the burial details grew larger. The camp had 3 separate compounds at its peak. Camp 1 held the sick and disabled. Camp 2 housed healthier prisoners assigned to work details. Camp 3 served as a transient facility. By 1944, only Camp 1 remained operational, its population reduced by death and transfer to other locations. Prisoners organized secret resistance despite the risks. Some built hidden radios from scrounged parts, carefully dismantling and hiding components during Japanese inspections. Others established smuggling networks with Filipino civilians who risked execution to provide medicine and food. A few prisoners maintained detailed records of Japanese atrocities, hiding documents in latrines and buried containers, determined that someone survived to tell what happened. The Filipino underground proved essential to prisoner survival. Led by people like Margaret Utinsky and Naomi Flores, Filipino civilians smuggled thousands of quinine tablets into the camp, saving hundreds of lives from malaria. They passed messages between prisoners and their families, providing evidence that the outside world had not forgotten them. Some paid with their lives when Japanese authorities discovered their activities. Work details varied in scope and brutality. The 500-acre camp farm grew food primarily for Japanese use, with prisoners receiving minimal portions. At the Cabanatuan Airport detail, men worked to repair and enlarge the runway for Japanese aircraft. Smaller details gathered firewood, dug latrines, prepared military defenses, and dug foxholes. Men too sick to work faced reduced rations, creating a death spiral where weakness led to starvation, which led to death. Starting in 1942, the Japanese began shipping prisoners to other locations for forced labor. Thousands were transported to Japan, Formosa, Manchuria, and other occupied territories. Many died during transport when Allied submarines or aircraft attacked unmarked Japanese ships carrying prisoners. The Japanese refused to mark prison ships, resulting in tragic incidents where Allied forces unknowingly killed their own men. By mid-1943, more than half the original Cabanatuan prisoners were dead. The survivors had watched friends die of starvation, disease, random violence. They had watched Japanese guards execute men for stealing food, for talking back, for being too sick to work. The psychological toll was worse than the physical suffering. Some men simply stopped trying. They stopped eating what little food they received. They stopped getting up for formation. They lay in their bunks waiting to die. The other prisoners called it giving up. The camp doctors called it terminal despair. The Japanese called it acceptable. By December 1944, approximately 516 Americans remained alive at Cabanatuan. Most were too weak to walk without assistance. Many suffered from untreated tropical ulcers, gangrene, infections that had progressed for months or years. The youngest prisoner was 20 years old. The oldest was 56. The average prisoner weighed less than 90 pounds. The worst part was not knowing if anyone cared. The Japanese told prisoners daily that America had forgotten them, that their families believed them dead, that no one was coming to save them. Some prisoners believed it. They wrote letters that would never be sent. They made plans for after the war they would never see. They told themselves stories about rescue that seemed more desperate with each passing month. Then, on December 14th, 1944, something happened that confirmed their worst fears. The Palawan massacre occurred on December 14th on Palawan Island, 300 miles south of Luzon. 150 American prisoners were held there in a camp similar to Cabanatuan. When American forces landed on nearby Mindoro, the Japanese camp commander received orders from Tokyo. Execute the prisoners. Leave no witnesses. The guards told prisoners there would be an air raid drill. They ordered everyone into covered trenches. Once the prisoners were inside, guards poured gasoline into the trenches and threw in lit torches. Men were burned alive. Those who tried to escape were machine-gunned or bayoneted. 11 men survived. They jumped into the ocean, swam to nearby cliffs, and hid until nightfall. Filipino guerrillas found them and smuggled them to American lines. Those survivors told their story to Army intelligence officers. The massacre reached 6th Army headquarters within 48 hours. General Walter Kruger understood the implications immediately. If the Japanese were executing prisoners on Palawan, they would execute prisoners everywhere. There were thousands of American prisoners in camps across the Philippines. Kruger needed to rescue them before the Japanese could carry out similar orders. Major Robert Lapham commanded Filipino guerrilla forces near Cabanatuan. Lapham was 28 years old, from Iowa, fluent in Tagalog, and had been living behind Japanese lines for 3 years. His guerrillas controlled most of the rural areas around Cabanatuan. They knew every road, every village, every Japanese position. On January 26th, Lapham rode 30 miles through Japanese territory to reach 6th Army headquarters. His horse was exhausted. Lapham had not slept in 2 days. But he had information that could not wait. He met with Colonel Horton White, 6th Army intelligence officer. Lapham spread a hand-drawn map on the table. He pointed to Cabanatuan prison camp, marked with a red circle. Approximately 500 American prisoners, Lapham said. Most are survivors of Bataan and Corregidor. The Japanese have orders to execute them if American forces approach. There are about 200 guards in the camp. Another 1,000 soldiers bivouacked at Cabu Creek, less than a mile north of the compound. 5,000 more Japanese in Cabanatuan City, 4 miles south. The main highway in front of the camp is heavily trafficked with retreating Japanese units, tanks, trucks, entire battalions moving through daily. White listened without interrupting. When Lapham finished, White asked one question. Can they be rescued? Lapham said yes. But it needs to happen immediately. Once American forces get closer, the Japanese will execute the prisoners rather than let them be liberated. White contacted Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, commander of the 6th Ranger Battalion. The Rangers had been training for exactly this type of mission. Small unit operations, hit-and-run attacks, rescues behind enemy lines. Mucci had 121 men available. White told him to select his best company and prepare for a raid 30 miles behind. Japanese lines. Mucci selected C Company and F Company. He also requested Alamo Scouts, elite reconnaissance units that specialized in intelligence gathering deep in enemy territory. 2 Alamo Scout teams were assigned, Team Nellist and Team Rounceville, 14 men total, the best reconnaissance specialists in the Pacific Theater. The mission briefing was held on January 27th. Mucci outlined the plan. Rangers would infiltrate through Japanese lines, link up with Filipino guerrillas, assault the camp at dusk, evacuate all prisoners, and return to American lines before Japanese reinforcements could respond. The entire operation had to be completed in under 12 hours. Any longer and they would be caught in daylight with 500 barely mobile former prisoners and Japanese divisions converging from multiple directions. The risks were extraordinary. 30 miles behind enemy lines with no air support and minimal backup. If anything went wrong, extraction would be impossible. The Rangers would be surrounded, outnumbered, and eliminated. But the alternative was allowing 500 Americans to be executed. The choice was clear. Mucci emphasized 3 non-negotiable requirements. First, complete surprise. If the Japanese detected the approach, they would execute the prisoners before the Rangers reached the camp. Second, perfect timing. Every element had to coordinate precisely. The blocking forces, the assault teams, the prisoner evacuation, all needed to happen simultaneously. Third, 0 prisoners left behind. Every man comes out or nobody comes out. The Rangers prepared with intensity. They cleaned weapons, checked ammunition loads, reviewed map studies, and mentally rehearsed their individual roles. Some wrote letters home, understanding they might not survive. Others prayed. A few simply sat in silence, processing what they were about to attempt. Captain Robert Prince would lead the assault. Prince was 25 years old, from Seattle. Soft-spoken and methodical. His men called him careful. Officers who had trained with him called him meticulous. Mucci called him the most tactically sound company commander in the battalion. Prince studied the intelligence reports. The camp was surrounded by open fields that had been cleared to prevent prisoner escapes. Guard towers at each corner, wire fencing, barracks for guards. Transient quarters for Japanese units passing through the area. The buildings where prisoners were housed were in the northwest corner of the compound. The biggest problem was not the camp itself. It was the Japanese force at Cabu Creek, 1,000 soldiers with tanks, trucks, and heavy weapons. If they responded to the attack, They could reach the camp in minutes. The Rangers would be caught in the open with prisoners who could barely walk. Prince needed a blocking force, something that could hold that bridge long enough for the rescue to be completed, something that could stop 1,000 Japanese infantry from crossing a river. That was when Juan Pajota entered the planning. Pajota had been fighting the Japanese since January 1942. He was 31 years old, a former Philippine Scouts lieutenant, trained at the Philippine Military Academy. When the Philippines fell, Pajota refused to surrender. He took his men into the mountains and began a guerrilla campaign that would last the entire war. By January 1945, Pajota commanded approximately 250 guerrillas in the Cabanatuan region. They were farmers, former soldiers, students, anyone willing to fight. They had been attacking Japanese convoys, cutting supply lines, rescuing downed American pilots, and gathering intelligence for 3 years. Pajota met with Mucci and Prince at Balangcarin village on January 29th. Pajota brought maps, sketches, intelligence reports his men had compiled over months of observation. He knew the camp layout better than the Rangers, knew their own base. But Pajota had concerns. He asked Mucci when they planned to attack. Mucci said tonight, January 29th. Pajota said no. The highway in front of the camp had been packed with Japanese traffic all day, columns of trucks, tanks, entire units moving north. An attack tonight would be detected immediately. They needed to wait until traffic decreased. Also, Pajota said, the 1,000 Japanese at Kabu Creek were on alert. His scouts had observed increased patrols, defensive preparations. Something had them spooked. An attack while they were alert would be suicide. Mucci did not want to delay. Every day increased the risk that prisoners would be executed. But Prince agreed with Pajota. They needed better conditions. One more day might make the difference between success and catastrophe. The attack was rescheduled for January 30th at dusk. That gave Pajota 24 hours to solve an impossible problem. How do 200 guerrillas stop 1,000? Trained infantry? Most commanders would have focused on firepower, more guns, more ammunition, more explosives. But Pajota understood something more important. He understood psychology. He understood that the Japanese had been winning for 3 years, that they expected inferior forces to retreat, that they had grown accustomed to easy victories against weaker opponents. Pajota planned to use that confidence against them. He positioned his men in a V-shaped formation along the south bank of the Kabu River. The bridge was the choke point. Any force crossing would have to funnel through that bridge, exposing themselves to concentrated fire from both flanks. Pajota placed machine guns at the apex of the V. These guns could fire continuously for minutes without overheating. They would create a wall of bullets that nothing could cross. He buried 25 landmines on the approaches to the bridge. Japanese infantry tactics relied on mass charges. Those mines would tear apart the first waves and create obstacles for following troops. He placed demolition charges under the bridge itself. The charges would not destroy the bridge completely. That would have been ideal, but required more explosives than they had. Instead, they would blow a hole large enough that tanks could not cross, and troops would have to navigate around the damage, slowing their advance. Most importantly, Pajota positioned himself and his command element where they could see the entire battlefield. He needed to direct fire, call out targets, and maintain morale when his men started taking casualties, because they would take casualties. There was no scenario where 200 men held off 1,000 without losses. On January 28th, the Rangers departed from Guimba, traveling in trucks to the last American outpost. From there, they would move on foot through Japanese-controlled territory. The journey began at dusk, using darkness for concealment. Filipino guerrillas guided them through the backcountry, avoiding Japanese patrols and checkpoints. Local villagers had been instructed to pen their chickens and muzzle their dogs to prevent noise that might alert Japanese forces. Some families moved temporarily from areas near the planned route, their absence less suspicious than remaining and risking discovery of the large American force moving through. The infiltration required absolute noise discipline. Rangers wrapped equipment to prevent rattling. They communicated with hand signals. They moved in single file, each man maintaining visual contact with the man ahead. Japanese truck convoys passed within yards of their positions. They froze, barely breathing, while enemy soldiers drove past unknowing. On the morning of January 30th, the Rangers began their final approach. They moved in daylight, crawling through rice paddies, hiding in irrigation ditches whenever Japanese vehicles passed on the road. The advance was agonizingly slow. They covered 800 yards in 6 hours. The Alamo Scouts went ahead. Lieutenant Bill Nellist and Private First Class Rufo Vacular disguised themselves as Filipino farmers, complete with straw hats and farm tools. They walked openly to a grass hut 300 yards from the camp gates. From inside the hut, they could see the entire compound. For 2 hours, Nellist and Vacular observed. They counted guard positions, noted shift changes, identified the prisoners' barracks, and located a shed containing 4 Japanese tanks. They sketched everything. When they finished, they crawled back to the Ranger position and delivered their report. Prince adjusted his plan based on the new intelligence. F Company, under 2nd Lieutenant John Murphy, would attack the front gate and eliminate the guard towers. C Company, under Prince, would hit the rear of the camp and clear the prisoner barracks. The attack would begin at exactly 1940 hours. A P-61 Black Widow night fighter would buzz the primes at camp to distract the guards, while Rangers crawled into position. At 1800 hours, Pajota and his guerrillas moved into position at the bridge. The Japanese across the river were finishing evening formation. Pajota could hear their officers shouting orders. He could see campfires being lit. He could smell food cooking. 1,000 men preparing for a quiet evening, unaware that in 90 minutes their position would be under attack. Pajota checked his watch. 1910 hours. 30 minutes until the Rangers attacked. His men were ready, machine guns loaded, mines armed, demolitions prepared. Now they waited. 1930 hours. 10 minutes. Pajota could hear the P-61 approaching from the south. The distinctive twin-boom sound of the aircraft engines carried across the rice paddies. The plane roared over the camp, engine backfiring, performing aerobatics, drawing every Japanese guard's attention skyward. 1940 hours. Pajota heard the first shots from the camp. F Company had opened fire. The sound was unmistakable. M1919A, 4 machine guns, M1 rifles, the heavy thump of grenades. The attack had begun. Across the river, the Japanese camp erupted. Officers were shouting, men running for weapons, trucks starting. Pajota could see them organizing, forming up, preparing to move. They would cross the bridge. They would reinforce the camp. They would kill every ranger and every prisoner unless Pajota stopped them. The first Japanese soldiers reached the bridge approach at 1942 hours. They were running, no tactical formation, just a mass charge toward the sound of gunfire. Pajota waited. His men had orders to hold fire until the enemy was committed to the bridge approach. 50 Japanese soldiers were on the bridge when Pajota gave the order. His guerrillas opened fire simultaneously, machine guns and nearly 200 rifles firing into a concentrated area. The effect was devastating. The bridge approach became a killing zone. Japanese soldiers fell in clusters. Those behind them tried to retreat, but more soldiers were pushing forward. The bridge became choked with bodies. 1944 hours. Pajota detonated the charges under the bridge. The explosion created a large hole in the structure, not enough to stop infantry, but enough that vehicles could not cross. A Japanese tank attempted to cross anyway. It fell into the hole and blocked the bridge completely. More Japanese soldiers were charging. Pajota could see officers trying to organize them, trying to form proper assault lines. But the V-shaped defensive position caught them in a crossfire. Every approach was covered. Machine gun fire swept across the riverbank. Rifles picked off officers. The Japanese were taking horrific casualties and gaining no ground. 1946 hours. Pajota saw Japanese soldiers attempting to flank his position. They were moving downstream, trying to cross the river away from the bridge. Pajota had anticipated this. He had positioned a reserve squad with orders to watch the flanks. They engaged the flanking force. Within minutes, the flanking attempt was annihilated. Bodies floated downstream in the current. The Japanese tried again. Another mass charge at the bridge. This time, they brought forward a second tank. The tank fired its main gun at the guerrilla positions. The round exploded near one of the machine gun nests, killing 2 guerrillas and wounding 3 more. A guerrilla with a bazooka, trained only that morning by rangers, stood up with the weapon. He had never fired it in combat. The tank was 200 yards away, moving, partially obscured by smoke. He aimed, breathed out, and fired. The bazooka round struck the tank's front armor and penetrated. The tank stopped, hatches flew open, crew evacuated. Before they could reach cover, rifle fire cut them down. The same guerrilla reloaded and destroyed 3 more tanks attempting to cross, 4 Japanese. Tanks destroyed by a fighter who had learned to use the weapon that morning. 1950 hours. The Japanese stopped charging. Pajota could see them reorganizing, pulling back, establishing defensive positions on their side of the river. They had taken massive casualties, lost their tanks, and failed to cross the bridge. For the moment, the attack was paused. But Pajota knew they would try again. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized aggressive assault. They would regroup and charge again and again, until either the bridge fell or they ran out of men. 1952 hours. The Japanese charged for the 3rd time. This assault was better organized. They used smoke grenades for concealment. They concentrated fire on the machine gun positions to suppress the guerrillas. They advanced in proper fire and maneuver teams, some shooting while others moved. It was the most dangerous moment of the engagement. Pajota's men were taking sustained fire. Casualties were mounting, the Toding River revolting. Machine gun positions were under constant bombardment. If one of those guns went silent, the entire defensive line could collapse. But the guerrillas held. They had personal stakes in this fight that went beyond tactics or duty. Many had family members who died at Japanese hands. Many had spent 3 years watching their country occupied, their people starved, their culture suppressed. This bridge was more than a military objective. It was revenge, justice, liberation, all concentrated into a few square yards of ground they would not surrender. 1958 hours. Pajota saw a red flare rise from the prison camp. That was Prince's signal. The Rangers had evacuated all prisoners. They were moving toward the Pampanga River rendezvous point. The mission was complete. But Pajota could not withdraw yet. The prisoners were still within range. If Japanese forces crossed the bridge now, they could intercept the evacuation. Pajota needed to hold for at least 10 more minutes, 20 hours. Another Japanese charge. This one was desperate, suicidal. They knew the prisoners were escaping. They knew reinforcements would arrive too late. This was their last chance to salvage something from the disaster. They charged straight into the machine gun fire. No cover, no concealment, just running directly at the bridge. Dozens fell. Then dozens more. The machine guns were overheating, barrels glowing red from sustained fire. Guerrillas were pouring water on them to cool them down while continuing to fire. 2 hours. The charge broke. The surviving Japanese soldiers retreated. They had lost more than half their force trying to cross that bridge. Their officers were dead or wounded. Their tanks were destroyed. Their morale was shattered. 20:05 hours. Prince fired a second red flare. That was the signal for Pajota to withdraw. The prisoners were across the Pampanga River. They were safe. Pajota gave the order. His guerrillas pulled back, by squads, covering each other's retreat. They moved quickly through pre-planned withdrawal routes. Behind them, the bridge was littered with Japanese dead. Pajota estimated more than 400 enemy killed. His guerrillas had suffered 21 killed and approximately 30 wounded. Against 1,000 attackers supported by armor, his 200 men had held that bridge for 25 minutes and inflicted a casualty ratio of more than 15 to 1. But Pajota had no time to count bodies or assess damage. His guerrillas had to reach the rendezvous point, help evacuate prisoners, and get everyone across the Pampanga before dawn. Japanese forces were converging on the area. If they were caught in daylight, the entire rescue would be lost. The Rangers had needed 30 minutes to assault the camp, evacuate 516 prisoners, and move to the river. Pajota had given them 30 minutes. Not 35, not 25. Exactly 30 minutes, because that was what the mission required, and Pajota understood that in this type of operation, timing mattered more than firepower. At the prison camp, Prince's assault had gone nearly perfectly. The P-61 distraction had worked. Japanese guards had been staring at the sky when Rangers opened fire. Within 15 seconds, every guard tower and pillbox had been neutralized. F Company blew the main gate lock with a .45 caliber pistol and poured into the compound. The Japanese guards retreated to their barracks and attempted to organize a defense. They never had the chance. Rangers cleared the barracks with grenades and rifle fire. Resistance collapsed within minutes. The camp was secure. Inside the prisoner barracks, men reacted with confusion and disbelief. Some thought it was a Japanese trick. Others believed they were hallucinating from fever and malnutrition. Rangers had to convince prisoners that the rescue was real, that Americans had come for them, that they were finally going home. Some prisoners wept. Others laughed hysterically. A few were too weak to react at all. Rangers found men who weighed less than 80 pounds, barely alive, unable to comprehend what was happening. Medical personnel quickly assessed who could walk and who needed immediate carrying. The evacuation revealed the full extent of prisoner suffering. Men had tropical ulcers that exposed bone. Others had untreated fractures that had healed incorrectly. Many were blind from vitamin deficiencies. Some had lost the ability to speak from prolonged isolation. The Rangers saw firsthand what 3 years of Japanese captivity had done to American soldiers. One prisoner, a colonel who had commanded thousands of men before Bataan, weighed 79 pounds and could barely whisper. Another, a former athlete, had legs so thin that Rangers feared they would break if lifted incorrectly. These were not the vigorous young men who had deployed to the Philippines in 1941. These were broken survivors who had endured hell. But then Prince encountered a problem he had not fully anticipated. The prisoners were in worse condition than intelligence had suggested. Many could not walk. Some could not stand. They had been starving for 3 years, and the sudden excitement of rescue was causing medical emergencies. Several prisoners were having heart attacks from shock and stress. Prince ordered his men to carry everyone who could not walk. If necessary, carry 2 men per ranger. No one gets left behind. That had been Muchi's order, and Prince would execute it regardless of how difficult it made the evacuation. Rangers hoisted prisoners onto their backs and began moving toward the gate. Some prisoners weighed less than 90 pounds. Rangers could carry them easily. Other prisoners were in such poor condition that Rangers had to fashion litters from bamboo and cloth. One prisoner died of a heart attack as a ranger carried him through the gate. He had survived 3 years of captivity, survived disease and starvation and torture, and died 100 feet from freedom. The ranger who had been carrying him wept openly but kept moving. There were 515 other men who needed to get out. By 2000 hours, every living prisoner was out of the camp. Prince formed them into a column with rangers providing security on all sides. They moved as quickly as the prisoners could manage, which was not fast enough. Japanese reinforcements were coming from Cabanatuan City. If they did not reach the Pampanga River within the hour, they would be caught. Local Filipino villagers had organized a caravan of carabao carts, water buffalo-drawn wagons used for transporting rice and goods. Captain Pajota had arranged for these carts days earlier. There were supposed to be 26 carts. By the time the column reached the river, there were over 100. Villagers from every nearby barangay had brought their carts, their animals, their children, to help evacuate the prisoners. The prisoners were loaded into carts. Those who could walk were helped across the river on foot. The evacuation became a community effort. Filipino civilians risked their lives to help men they had never met, men from a country thousands of miles away, simply because it was the right thing to do. By midnight, the entire force was across the Pampanga. Prince sent word to 6th Army headquarters. Mission successful. 516 prisoners liberated, 2 Rangers killed, 4 wounded. Estimated 500 to 1,000 Japanese casualties. General Walter Kruger received the message at 0100 hours on January 31st. He immediately ordered a cordon of American forces to move forward and secure the evacuation route. By dawn, the rescued prisoners were behind American lines. 3 years of captivity were over. The 2 Rangers killed were Captain James Fisher, the battalion surgeon, who was mortally wounded by Japanese mortar fire and died, January 31st, saying his last words were about the prisoners, and Corporal Roy Sweezy, who was struck by friendly fire from a nervous ranger after the assault ended. 21 Filipino guerrillas died at the Kabu River Bridge, holding their positions against impossible odds. Their sacrifice made the rescue possible. The Japanese reaction was confusion and rage. Senior officers could not understand how such a small American force had penetrated 30 miles behind their lines, destroyed a camp, and evacuated hundreds of prisoners. They suspected betrayal by local Filipinos, which was accurate but unhelpful. The damage was done. More concerning was the engagement at the Kabu River Bridge. Japanese commanders reviewing the battlefield found over 400 dead, multiple destroyed tanks, and evidence of a well-executed defensive action. The after-action reports struggled to explain how guerrillas had inflicted such casualties. Official Japanese army doctrine said guerrillas were inferior fighters who would break under sustained attack. This engagement proved otherwise. The tactical implications were significant. If Filipino guerrillas could hold defensive positions against superior numbers, then Japanese forces could not assume easy victory in future engagements. Every bridge, every road, every village could potentially become a killing zone. That uncertainty eroded Japanese confidence and forced them to commit more troops to rear area security, troops desperately needed at the front lines. The rescue had broader strategic impact. American forces conducted 4 more prison camp raids in the following month using similar tactics: Rangers or scouts for assault, Filipino guerrillas for blocking positions, local civilians for evacuation support. Those raids rescued over 7,000 prisoners total. For the prisoners, return to American lines meant medical treatment, real food, and the slow process of recovery. Many required hospitalization for months. Some never fully recovered from tropical diseases contracted in the camps, but they were alive, and that was more than any of them had expected a week earlier. Medical examinations documented systematic starvation and abuse. The average rescued prisoner weighed between 70 and 90 pounds. Many suffered from beriberi, pellagra, scurvy, dysentery, and multiple parasitic infections simultaneously. Dental examinations revealed teeth lost to malnutrition. X-rays showed fractures that had never been set. The physical evidence supported war crimes charges. Prisoner testimonies provided detailed accounts of Japanese atrocities. They described the Bataan Death March with specifics. Exact locations where men were bayoneted, names of Japanese officers who ordered executions, dates and details of specific incidents. They documented daily conditions at Cabanatuan, the starvation rations, the arbitrary beatings, the men worked to death, the sick left to die, without medical care. These testimonies became critical evidence in war crimes prosecutions after the war. Several Japanese officers responsible for prisoner camps were tried and convicted based on survivor accounts from Cabanatuan and other facilities. The rescued prisoners had kept their promise to document everything, and their records ensured accountability. The rescue also allowed families to learn what happened to loved ones who had died in captivity. Survivors carried messages from men who did not survive, final words for wives and children, details about how and where men died. For families who had received telegrams stating missing in action or presumed dead, these personal accounts provided closure that official records could not. Mucci and Prince received the Distinguished Service Cross for their leadership. All Rangers received Silver Stars or Bronze Stars. The 14 Alamo Scouts received Presidential Unit citations. General MacArthur personally presented awards on March 3, 1945, stating, "No incident of the campaign in the Pacific has given me such satisfaction as the release of the POWs at Cabanatuan. The mission was brilliantly successful. The Filipino guerrillas received Bronze Stars for their officers, but no formal recognition came for most participants. The United States government classified them as irregulars rather than official military units, creating legal complications regarding benefits and recognition. Juan Pajota continued fighting until the Philippines were fully liberated in August 1945. After the war, he applied for American citizenship as recognition for his service during the raid. The application sat in bureaucracy for over 30 years. Pajota traveled to the United States in 1976 to follow up on his application in person. He died of a heart attack on December 20, 1976, while waiting for the paperwork to be processed. His citizenship was approved 3 days after his death. That injustice reflects a larger pattern of neglect toward Filipino veterans. It was not until 2003 that the United States and Philippine governments established a joint commission to provide delayed recognition to surviving Filipino veterans. Juan Pajota's family received his recognition posthumously at a ceremony in Manila in 2006, attended by American veterans who had been prisoners at Cabanatuan. The Cabanatuan raid succeeded because of combined arms operations, careful planning, Filipino intelligence networks, local civilian support, and a guerrilla commander who understood that sometimes the best tactics come from understanding your enemy's psychology rather than matching their firepower. Pajota did not win that bridge engagement because he had superior weapons or numbers. He won because he understood that Japanese infantry would charge repeatedly, that their tactical doctrine prioritized aggression over preservation of Jishin force, and that he could exploit that predictability by creating a killing zone they would charge into repeatedly until their force was destroyed. The raid is studied at military academies as an example of special operations planning, emphasizing the Rangers' training, the Alamo Scouts' reconnaissance, and the careful coordination of timing. But the most tactically innovative element was Pajota's defensive plan at the bridge, which receives insufficient attention in most analyses, despite being the decisive action that prevented Japanese reinforcement. Modern military forces continue to study the engagement as an example of how to maximize advantages in unfavorable situations. The principles remain applicable. Use terrain to create force multipliers, understand enemy doctrine to predict their actions, position forces to create crossfire zones, and maintain morale through clear communication and shared purpose. The raid demonstrates that military success requires cooperation across different units and cultures. The Rangers, the Scouts, the guerrillas, and the civilians all performed essential roles. Remove any element, and the operation likely fails. That interdependence deserves emphasis in an era where individual heroism is often overemphasized. The operation also demonstrated the value of unconventional forces. The Filipino guerrillas were not professional soldiers in the traditional sense. They lacked formal military training, standardized equipment, and official command structures. Yet they proved more effective than conventional units because they understood local terrain, maintained intelligence networks, and operated with flexibility that rigid military organizations could not match. American military planners learned valuable lessons about working with indigenous forces. The raid showed that local allies could provide capabilities that even elite American units lacked: knowledge of enemy patterns, understanding of civilian populations, ability to operate undetected in occupied territory, and willingness to take extreme risks for their own liberation. Future Special Operations doctrine incorporated these lessons. The raid also influenced thinking about prisoner rescue operations. Prior to Cabanatuan, conventional military wisdom held that rescuing prisoners deep behind enemy lines was too risky to attempt during active combat. The successful rescue proved that with proper planning, intelligence, and local support, such operations were feasible. This emboldened planners to attempt similar rescues in later conflicts. The psychological impact extended beyond military circles. The American public, demoralized by years of war and worried about prisoners in Japanese hands, gained hope from the successful rescue. The story dominated newspaper headlines for weeks. The rescued prisoners became symbols of American resilience and determination. The Filipino guerrillas, though less recognized publicly, demonstrated the loyalty and courage of America's allies in the Pacific. This account has focused on Juan Pajota and the Kabu River Bridge because that engagement receives insufficient attention despite being the most tactically challenging and decisive action of the entire operation. The complete story includes the Rangers' assault, the scouts' reconnaissance, the prisoners' survival, and the civilians' support. Every element mattered. Lieutenant Colonel Shigeji Mori, the camp commander, was tried for war crimes at Yokohama in October through November 1947. The military commission found him guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment at hard labor. The commission gave him life rather than death because orders came from higher authority. Colonel Robert Prince survived the war, returned to Washington State, and died in 2008 at age 89. He never forgot Pajota's role in the raid's success and advocated throughout his life for proper recognition of Filipino contributions. Sergeant James Baldassar, the supply clerk from the 31st Infantry who had survived the death march and 3 years at Cabanatuan, returned home to a hero's welcome he did not feel he deserved. Like many survivors, he struggled with guilt about living when so many comrades had died. He spent years writing letters to families of men who had not survived, providing details about their final days, ensuring they were remembered. His personal mission was to make certain that the dead of Cabanatuan were not forgotten by a nation eager to move past the war's horrors. Many rescued prisoners faced difficulty adjusting to normal life. 3 years of starvation and abuse left psychological scars that 1945 medicine could not treat. Some developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Others experienced survivor's guilt, asking why they had lived when friends had died. The physical recovery took months or years. The psychological recovery, for many, never fully occurred. Annual reunions brought survivors together, providing community with others who understood what they had endured. At these gatherings, former prisoners shared stories, remembered the dead, and honored the Rangers and Filipino guerrillas who had saved their lives. As years passed and numbers dwindled, these reunions became increasingly important for preserving memory and ensuring the story was passed to younger generations. The liberated prisoners testified at war crimes trials, providing crucial evidence against Japanese officers responsible for atrocities. Their detailed accounts, corroborated by hidden documents and multiple witnesses, resulted in convictions and sentences. Some survivors found this process therapeutic, achieving a measure of justice for what had been done. Others found it reopened wounds they had tried to close. All recognized it as necessary to hold perpetrators accountable and establish historical record. As we remember the Cabanatuan raid 8 decades later, we should remember it accurately. Not as an American operation with Filipino assistance, but as a joint operation where Filipino forces played the decisive role in the most challenging engagement. Not as a rescue of helpless victims, but as liberation made possible by men who maintained hope through 3 years of captivity. Not as victory through superior firepower, but as success earned through superior planning, courage, and sacrifice by Americans, Filipinos, and civilians working together toward a common purpose.